The hour was an abyss of midnight blue, deeper than any ink Elias had ever seen, yet thin enough for the distant cold light of a half-moon to press against the tall, grimy window of the dormitory. Elias lay stiffly on his mattress, which smelled eternally of institutional disinfectant and stale sweat, his 11-year-old body vibrating with a terror that felt less like fear and more like a feverish, absolute necessity. He had been planning this trespass for weeks. It was an obsession, fueled by a deep, gnawing conviction that the narrative offered by St. Jude's Home for Wayward Children, the clean, simple story of an infant abandoned on the front steps, identity unknown, was a meticulously constructed lie. Sister Mary Agnes, the granite-faced overseer, repeated it with the same measured cadence every time a new social worker or curious donor visited. A blank slate, dear boy. A tragedy of the modern age. But Elias was not a blank slate. He was a mosaic of half-remembered sensations, the smell of pine and gasoline, the sound of a certain lullaby hummed slightly off-key, the feeling of wool against his cheek. These fragments did not belong to the cold beige world of St. Jude's. Tonight was the night, because the fear of remaining ignorant had finally outweighed the fear of Sister Mary Agnes's righteous wrath. The attic, perched like a dusty, forbidden crown atop the 3-story brick structure, contained the archives, the forgotten histories, the legal filings, the scraps of paper that might define his origin. No child was ever permitted near the third-floor hallway, much less the attic access door, which was secured by a heavy brass lock, tarnished green with decades of neglect. Elias slid his legs over the edge of the mattress. The cheap polyester blanket rasped against the rough skin of his knees. He waited, motionless, allowing his ears to calibrate to the low, grinding symphony of the sleeping orphanage. The rhythmic, guttural snore of Old Man Peterson, the night watchman who often slept through his rounds near the kitchen, provided a comforting, heavy anchor of sound. The wind moaned outside, catching the loose slate tiles on the roof, mimicking the sound of weeping. He wore only a thin, grey cotton shirt and shorts, silent against his skin. His feet were bare. The floorboards of the dormitory were cold and tacky beneath his soles, but he moved with the stealth of a creature long accustomed to darkness and necessity. He had practiced this path hundreds of times in his head. His objective required a tool, the key. Weeks ago, while scrubbing the baseboards of the rarely used utility closet near Sister Mary Agnes's office, a punishment detail for leaving a shoe untied, Elias had noticed a subtle discoloration in the dark wood of the floor. Not rot, but a small, expertly cut rectangle, almost imperceptible. Driven by an irrational curiosity, he had worked at it with the tip of a rusty nail he had pocketed, until a small panel of wood, no wider than his thumb, lifted free. Inside, nestled in the dust and insulation, lay a single heavy brass key, identical in size and shape to the one Sister Mary Agnes wore on a chain, only older, heavier, and completely black with grime. He had hidden it inside the lining of his worn tennis shoe, the cold metal a constant pressure against his heel, a promise of liberation or destruction. Elias crept down the main staircase. Each step was a nerve-wracking gamble. The central staircase was a relic of the late 19th century, constructed of dense, groaning oak. He hugged the side railing, where the treads were marginally quieter, applying pressure slowly, waiting for the inevitable squeak, freezing in place when it came, letting the silence swallow the sound before moving again. He reached the second-floor landing. Here, the air was warmer, thicker with the scent of aged wallpaper and boiled cabbage from the day's dinner. The third-floor access door was situated at the end of a long, dark corridor used only for storage of seasonal decorations and outdated laundry equipment. The corridor was an endless tunnel of shadows. Elias moved past the massive silent shapes of stacked chairs and collapsed shelving units. His heart was no longer simply beating. It was thudding against his ribs, a wet, frantic drum in the absolute quiet. He could feel the fine hairs on his arms standing erect, reacting to the sheer weight of forbidden space. When he reached the attic door, he paused, leaning his forehead against the cold, rough wood. The brass lock gleamed faintly in the sparse moonlight filtering through the high window at the stairwell's end. It was the color of old blood. Elias fumbled inside his shorts pocket, retrieving the heavy brass key. His fingers were slick with nervous sweat. He inserted the key into the lock. It was a perfect fit. The tumblers shifted inside the mechanism with a series of tiny metallic clicks, agonizingly loud in the suffocating silence. He turned the key. C-H-U-N-K. The sound of the bolt retracting resonated down the empty hallway. Elias froze, pressing himself flat against the door, waiting for a light to flip on, for a shout, for the heavy, dragging footsteps of Old Man Peterson. Nothing. Only the ceaseless groan of the wind outside, a sound that seemed to mock his fear. He turned the knob slowly, fighting the urge to tear the door open and rush in. The hinges were dry and thick with rust. They protested his movement with a long, drawn-out S-C-R-E-E-E-E-C-H, a sound that felt sharp enough to shatter the glass of the window panes. He nudged the door open just enough to slip through the gap, minimizing the strain on the hinges. He was inside the attic stairwell. The air immediately changed. It was hot, still, and suffocating, thick with the smell of trapped heat, desiccated wood, and the overwhelming scent of decades-old dust. This was the breath of the forgotten past. The stairs were steep, narrow, and unlit. Elias could discern the path only by the faint silvering of moonlight that sliced through the triangular window high up near the apex of the roofline. He climbed meticulously, placing his weight on the very edges of the treads to avoid the deep central divots where the wood was weakest and most likely to cry out. The sheer scale of the room was intimidating. It was a cavernous space under the inverted V of the roof. Massive, dusty timbers crisscrossed overhead, structural bones holding the world at bay. The floorboards were wide and uneven, covered in a thick, insulating layer of fine, grey dust that puffed up around his feet with every tentative step. The attic was not empty. It was crammed, piled high with the remnants of every decade St. Jude's had existed, broken furniture draped in enormous, shapeless white sheets, stacks of mildewed textbooks bound with disintegrating twine, trunks and cedar chests positioned haphazardly like ancient sleeping beasts. Elias had one specific mission, informed by snippets of conversation he'd overheard between staff members. Mostly Sister Veronica's grumbling about filing compliance a few months prior. The oldest, most sensitive records were kept not in the main office, which was frequently accessed, but in the most remote, least disturbed area of the attic, the back corner near the defunct chimney flue. He began his traverse. The silence here was different, a heavy, pressed quiet, punctuated by the scuttling sounds of small, unseen things in the eaves. Each footfall on the dusty boards felt like the crack of a pistol. He moved toward the back wall. The light was almost entirely gone here, necessitating a painful reliance on touch. He trailed his hand along the draped furniture, feeling the rough texture of the sheets and the sharp edges of broken wooden frames underneath. He reached the corner. Against the brick of the chimney foundation stood 3 large, institutional-grade metal filing cabinets, the kind used in government offices 50 years ago. They were olive green, rusted at the corners, and secured not by keys, but by thick industrial padlocks. Despair threatened to crush the fragile hope that had brought him here. The lie seemed to mock him from behind the impenetrable metal. They really did lock everything away. He knelt in the dust, running his fingers along the cold metal of the lowest cabinet. The cabinets were labeled with ancient fading Dymo tape strips. He felt the letters blindly. The first read, Maintenance and Property. The second, Ledgers and Grants. The third, the one closest to the floor, was labeled Historical Intake, 1940–1980. Elias pressed his face against the cool metal of the third cabinet. He was born in the 1980s, according to the records they had given him, but the intake year was less important than the general category. This cabinet held the raw data, the first recordings of a child's presence. He stood desperately looking for any weakness. The padlocks were solid, thick rings of steel. There was no breaking them. Then his gaze fell on the floor directly in front of the cabinets. The dust here was thinner, disturbed slightly, not recently, but repeatedly over time. There was a faint, clean line in the floorboards. He pressed down with his heel. The board did not give. He tried again, using his fingernails to find the seam. He discovered a slight lip, a finger width away from the base of the cabinet. He pushed against it, and the board, which was slightly shorter than the others, slid forward with a soft, grinding sound of wood against wood. It was another hiding spot, much like the one where he had found the key. Inside this cavity was not another key, but a stack of files, tightly bundled in thick brown wax paper and secured with string that had turned brittle and white with age. They had been hidden under the floor, not in the cabinets, suggesting they were highly sensitive, perhaps actively removed from the locked storage. Elias's hands shook so violently he nearly dropped the bundle. The dry string snapped easily under the slightest tension. He peeled back the waxed paper. Inside were 4 large, thick manila folders. The tabs were handwritten in the familiar, severe script of Sister Mary Agnes, a hand that had not changed in 30 years. Elias had to sacrifice the secrecy of the deep dark for just a moment of light. He pulled out the thin plastic keychain flashlight he had bartered for a week's worth of his dessert pudding, an inventory item long forgotten in the orphanage's economy. He clicked the light on. It cast a weak yellow beam, but it was enough. He read the tabs: pending adoption, 1982–1985, financial anomalies, Elias Vance, 1984, deceased, notification waiver. Elias felt the air evacuate his lungs. The impact was physical, a punch to the diaphragm. Elias Vance, 1984, his name, his year, in the script of the woman who swore she had no records of his identity. He tossed the other folders aside, not caring where they landed. He opened the folder labeled with his name. The paper inside was crisp, protected by the brown wrapping. The folder contained a stack of documents, ordered neatly. There were hospital intake forms, a brief medical history detailing a complicated birth, and at the very top, the undeniable official item he had risked everything for, the birth certificate. It was printed on heavy, pale green cardstock, embossed with the official seal of the state bureaucracy, now slightly faded and smudged. The small flashlight beam made the ink leap out at him. He traced the words with a trembling finger, his vision momentarily blurring with the sheer magnitude of what he was seeing. Child's name, Elias Marco Vance. Date of birth, October 23rd, 1984. Place of birth, St. Bruno's Hospital, East Wing. He slid his finger down the column reserved for parental information. This was the heart of the lie. This was the abyss the orphanage had covered up with soft platitudes about fate and anonymity. Father's name, Marco Vance. Mother's name, Isabella Rivera. They had names. They were real people. The institution had not just lost his file, they had removed it, archived it in a hidden compartment, and deliberately erased his entire ancestry. A dry, harsh sob escaped his throat, trapped in the stifling heat of the attic. It was a noise that did not sound like his own voice. It was the sound of a fundamental reality being upended. The urgency of the moment intensified, transforming the initial fear of discovery into a burning, white-hot indignation. They had stolen his history. He flipped to the back pages of the file. There were hand-typed notes. These were the truly damning pieces of evidence. One sheet, dated 6 weeks after his birth, was a formal document addressed to the Office of St. Jude's Home, Attian supervisor. It was a notarized letter, crisp and professional. Subject: temporary custody arrangements, Elias Vance. Dear Supervisor, due to unexpected and severe health complications requiring specialized, long-term care for the mother and the father's immediate and mandatory transfer overseas for military service, we are temporarily transferring guardianship of Elias Marco Vance, age 6 weeks, to St. Jude's. Attached is a certified check for 12 months prepaid care, along with explicit instructions for monthly updates and the scheduled date of retrieval. The father will return to reclaim custody on or before October 23, 1985. Contact details are enclosed. Elias read the date of retrieval, October 23, 1985, his first birthday. He understood in a flash of blinding, painful clarity. His parents had not abandoned him. They had paid for his care, entrusted him to the home, and arranged to return. And St. Jude's had ensured they found nothing upon their return. They had been given a year's worth of financial support, and they had kept the money and erased the child's identity, converting him into a nameless ward of the state, a safer, cleaner transaction for the institution's books. The rage was instantaneous and total. It wasn't the shallow, childish anger of a reprimand. It was the corrosive, deep-seated fury of profound betrayal. The heat of the attic seemed to concentrate this feeling, turning his skin clammy. He clutched the entire file, the heavy cardstock certificate, the letter, the notes, and shoved it clumsily under his shirt, against his bare skin. The corners of the paper scratched him, a stinging reminder that this truth was physical, tangible. He extinguished the small flashlight. The darkness rushed back in, heavy and absolute. He stood up, his legs shaking, the adrenaline now overriding the initial terror. He did not care about the sound of his movements anymore. He needed to get out, and he needed to expose the lie. He replaced the floorboard panel, managing to slide it back into place, driven by a primal need to maintain the secrecy of his source. He would not give them the satisfaction of closing this loophole. Elias stumbled back across the attic floor, the loose dust swirling around his ankles, tasting metallic and bitter in his mouth. He reached the narrow stairwell and descended, relying entirely on memory and the pressure of the cool, damp wall against his shoulder. When he reached the third-floor corridor, he paused only long enough to insert the key back into the brass lock and secure the attic door with a decisive C-H-U-N-K. The sound echoed loudly, dangerously. He snatched the key out and tucked it back into his pocket. The deed was done. He moved with frantic speed down the main staircase, no longer caring about the creaking boards. His objective had shifted from discovery to confrontation. He was not merely a child sneaking out of bed. He was a revolutionary carrying the proof of tyranny. He knew exactly where to find Sister Mary Agnes. She rarely slept through the night, usually sequestered in her small office adjacent to the main chapel, maintaining the endless self-important paperwork that ran the facility. He reached the ground floor. The air here was damp and chilly, a shock after the intense heat of the attic. He crossed the tile floor of the administrative wing. The heavy oak door to her office was usually slightly ajar, letting out a thin shaft of yellow light and the smell of old paper and bitter black coffee. Tonight the light was visible. He approached the door, his chest heaving, his breath loud and ragged. He did not knock. He pushed the door open violently, wide enough for the heavy oak to slam against the plaster wall with a deafening crack. "Sister!" Sister Mary Agnes, a woman whose face was usually set in the severe, unflinching expression of moral authority, jumped so high she nearly knocked over the porcelain mug, balanced precariously on the edge of her blotter. Her thin silver hair, usually tucked meticulously beneath her white wimple, was slightly disheveled. She was wearing her spectacles, perched on the end of her prominent nose, magnifying her startled, sharp eyes. Elias, what is the meaning of this unholy racket? Do you know what time it is? Back to your dormitory immediately, or I swear by the blessed—" Her voice, usually a deep, calm monotone of control, was shaking slightly. Elias stepped fully into the room. The yellow light of the desk lamp illuminated the sheen of sweat on his forehead, the wide, panicked look in his eyes, and the unnatural stiffness of his posture. He was holding something pressed against his chest. "You lied," Elias stated, his voice cracking but laced with a searing, unexpected authority. It was not a question. It was an accusation, delivered with the absolute certainty of evidence. Sister Mary Agnes's expression immediately shifted from anger to a chilling, studied blankness. It was the look she reserved for moments of profound institutional risk. She stood up slowly, her hands gripping the edge of the desk, her knuckles turning white. "I have never lied to any child in the care of St. Jude's, Elias. Now put whatever you have down and tell me where you got it. If you have been stealing from the storage cupboards—" "I was never abandoned," Elias interrupted, his voice rising, the emotional containment beginning to break. He pulled the documents from under his shirt and slammed the stiff stack onto the desk, exactly between her folded hands and the porcelain mug. The sound was flat and definitive. "This is my birth certificate, Elias Marco Vance. My mother's name is Isabella Rivera. My father is Marco Vance. They paid for me. They had a date to come back. You kept this. You hid it. You told everyone I was nobody." Sister Mary Agnes did not look at the documents immediately. She looked only at Elias, her eyes narrowing to slits of cold, ancient fear. She knew instantly where he had been. She knew the location of the hidden floor cavity. The air in the small, cluttered office grew impossibly thick. The only sound was the persistent, rapid thump-thump of Elias's own frantic pulse filling his ears. "Elias, those documents are highly sensitive historical records. They are not meant for children. You have broken major rules of the home and endangered your residency here. You must calm yourself and allow me to explain the complexities of these matters." Her voice was now dangerously low, a deep, quiet threat. "Explain what? Explain how you stole my parents. Explain how you erased a whole year of payments and communication. Explain the letter that says they were coming back." Elias pointed a shaking finger at the formal notarized letter, which was now uppermost in the pile. Sister Mary Agnes finally dropped her gaze to the desk. Her eyes swept over the heavy cardstock, the official seal, the signature of the lawyer, and rested on the bolded date of retrieval, October 23rd, 1985. Her perfectly constructed composure began to crumble, not in a dramatic explosion, but in a slow, agonizing subsidence. The muscles around her jaw twitched involuntarily. Her face, usually so rigid and pale, seemed to drain of even more color. "The circumstances were different, Elias," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The letter says they were paying. It says they were overseas. It doesn't say I was an anonymous tragedy." Elias leaned over the desk, his hands braced on the wood, bringing his face close to hers. "You let people adopt children who had names and families waiting. Why? Why did you do this to me?" The raw, unmediated pain in his question seemed to pierce through the institutional defense mechanisms of the sister. For the first time, Elias saw not the warden, but a very old, very tired woman caught in a decades-old crime. She reached out a hand, intending perhaps to touch the certificate or perhaps to comfort Elias, but he recoiled instantly, stepping back as if burned. "Do not touch them," he spat. "They are mine, my only truth." Sister Mary Agnes withdrew her hand slowly, letting it drop heavily back to the desk. She looked at the documents, then at the key in Elias's pocket, then back at his face, seeing the profound, unfixable damage she had inflicted. She finally spoke, her voice dry and brittle as parchment. "Sit down, Elias. You deserve the entire difficult truth, but you must understand this was not malice toward a child. This was desperation. A moment in time that defined the survival of this institution." Elias did not sit. He remained standing, alert, vibrating with distrust, his fists clenched at his sides. "Tell me the truth, then," he demanded. "Every detail. I am not leaving until I know why you decided I deserved no name." Sister Mary Agnes sighed, a sound heavy with the dust of years. She pushed her chair back slightly and began to speak, her voice slow, laborious, painting a picture of an orphanage on the brink of collapse decades ago. In 1985, St. Jude's was facing closure. The city was withdrawing nearly all funding. We were desperate for capital to repair the heating system, or dozens of children would have been moved to the deplorable county shelters. When your file arrived, Elias, with that generous prepaid check for 12 months of care, it was a miracle. It was the exact amount needed to guarantee our next quarter. Elias listened, his eyes wide and fixed. He could feel the slow, dreadful shift in the narrative from personal betrayal to systemic corruption. The initial plan was to accept the money and then contact the agencies listed on the letter for monthly updates, as requested. But 2 months passed, the heating repairs were underway, and the funding was exhausted. Then another factor emerged: your parents' contact information. The letter mentioned they were on a military installation in a conflict zone. Communication became impossible. They were gone. The military contact listed was unresponsive. She paused, taking a slow, shaky breath. "When your first birthday approached, Elias, the deadline for their return, we received an official letter from the military marked sensitive clearance. It was brief. It informed us that Marco Vance was listed as missing in action. Isabella Rivera was still hospitalized, her recovery outlook highly uncertain, listed as a long-term critical care patient with no immediate kin. Elias's chest constricted, missing in action, not absent, not abandoning him out of apathy. We waited 6 more months, Elias. We continued to mark the file as intake pending retrieval. But the home had a problem. We had used the funds, and now we had a child with no active financial support and a complex legal status. The government wouldn't recognize your status as an abandoned minor because your parents had paid and had written arrangements. We were in a legal vacuum that meant the home would receive no state subsidies for your care." She lifted her hands in a gesture of defeated pleading. "It was either declare St. Jude's home insolvent, closing its doors and sending 60 children into uncertain futures, or simplify the bureaucracy." The simplification, Elias realized with a crushing horror, was the lie. "We destroyed the original intake file," Sister Mary Agnes admitted, her voice cracking for the first time. "We told the state and federal authorities that you were dropped off anonymously, an infant whose parents could not be traced. This allowed us to list you as a ward of the state, eligible for basic care funding." She pointed a trembling finger at the certificate and the notarized letter. "I could not bring myself to destroy all of it. It was evidence, yes, but it was also the truth. So I sequestered the core documents, hiding them where no auditor, no social worker, and certainly no child would ever think to look. You chose money over my history," Elias stated, his voice flat, drained of its initial fury, replaced now by a vast, echoing emptiness. "We chose 60 histories over one, Elias," she countered, her voice sharp with residual defensiveness. "It was a horrific, impossible choice made under duress, driven by the needs of the whole community." "But you never told me," Elias insisted, the pain returning, sharp and demanding. "Even when I turned 10, when I started asking real questions about my last name, you kept the door locked. The door stayed locked because the lie, once established, could never be undone," Sister Mary Agnes whispered. To reveal this file would have meant the immediate closure of St. Jude's, the invalidation of decades of financial reports, and the complete destruction of the institution I promised my life to uphold. I chose to bear the weight of that silence myself. Elias looked at the file again. It was no longer just a piece of paper. It was the entire foundation of his 11 years, suddenly revealed as fragile, rotten wood. He had believed he was unloved, that he was so easily forgotten that his parents couldn't even manage a name. The truth was that he was loved enough to be planned for, paid for, and expected home. His parents hadn't abandoned him. They had been casualties of war and illness, and the orphanage had capitalized on their tragedy. The gravity of the situation pressed down on Elias. He finally understood the cost of his discovery. He wasn't just exposing a personal lie. He was threatening the physical safety and housing of 60 other children. His righteous indignation clashed violently with his ingrained loyalty to the only home he had ever known, however flawed. He picked up the documents again, smoothing the corners, feeling the weight of the paper, the weight of his entire complicated identity. "My father was missing in action," Elias repeated, tasting the official dreadful terminology. "And my mother, Isabella Rivera, is she still at St. Bruno's Hospital?" Sister Mary Agnes nodded slowly. "She was there the last time I checked many years ago. She has been in long-term palliative care for 3 decades. She's not responsive, Elias. She hasn't been for most of your life." The last flicker of hope, the idea of walking out tomorrow and finding a waiting, loving parent, was extinguished with that single statement. His mother was a ghost, and his father was lost to the sea of official records. Elias put the documents back on the desk, his hands shaking less now, replaced by a deep, weary sorrow. The urgency had given way to a profound, complicated grief. "I need to know everything in this file," Elias said, his voice quiet, serious and adult. "Every detail about my parents, every note you destroyed, every piece of information you withheld." Sister Mary Agnes looked at the 11-year-old boy, standing in the cold light of her office, demanding accountability not with tears, but with cold, factual necessity. He was no longer a child. He was the keeper of her deepest secret. "I will tell you everything," she promised, her voice rough with genuine emotion. "But Elias, you cannot show these to anyone. If this file leaves this room and is seen by any outside official, St. Jude's will be immediately shut down. The children will pay the price for my actions 30 years ago." Elias looked at the document, the truth of his birth certificate shining under the harsh desk lamp. He looked at the woman who had robbed him of his identity, but protected the only home he had ever known. He was faced with the ultimate emotional drama: justice for himself or safety for his community. He reached out and gathered the file, clutching it tightly. He looked directly into the eyes of Sister Mary Agnes, eyes that held the accumulated guilt of a life spent in necessary compromise. "I will not tell them," Elias said. "Not yet, but this file stays with me. If I am to be nobody to the world, I must at least know who I am to myself." The sister visibly sagged with relief, a heavy draining movement of the shoulders. The institutional fear was momentarily quelled, replaced by personal shame. "Elias, what do you need from me now?" she asked, truly asking a question instead of issuing an order. "I need a lamp," Elias said simply, "and a place to sit. I need to read every word of this. I need to copy every date. And then I need to know how to find St. Bruno's Hospital and what the last known address for my father's family was." The intense rhythm of alert had transitioned into the steady, demanding rhythm of research. The immediate consequence was not a swift administrative punishment, but a slow, agonizing process of learning. Sister Mary Agnes slowly, meticulously cleared a space on the small, cluttered conference table near the window. She brought him a clean, thick cotton towel to wipe the dust from his hands and face. She brought him a fresh glass of water. And then, under the cold, silent watch of the institution, in the hours before the dawn, the former warden and the newly self-defined orphan sat across from each other. Sister Mary Agnes began to retrieve old, faded diaries and auxiliary ledgers from a locked cabinet she previously claimed did not exist. Elias opened the folder again, the heavy cardstock of the birth certificate now familiar and solid in his hands. He was no longer Elias, the anonymous ward. He was Elias Marco Vance, the boy whose parents were coming home on October 23rd, 1985. The orphanage had lied, and in that lie they had built a painful, absolute truth, a truth Elias was now ready to embrace, one painstakingly detailed word at a time. The path to his vulnerability and ultimate overcoming had just begun, charted by the sharp edges of forbidden paper.